This is Health Call Online, the place for extended versions of interviews heard in our weekly radio broadcast, the Health Call Radio Hour. You know, the idea of brain death is facing its biggest challenge in more than 60 years, ever since the concept first took hold in emergency rooms across the country. Some today are concerned that the science has gotten ahead of the law and now the rules and regulations just don't match, and clearly they're not consistent across the country. So there's an effort underway to rewrite the rules around when you are declared brain dead. And that has a big impact on families and, of course, also all those people on a transplant waiting list. Now, this topic was brought to my attention by an article in Nature magazine. It is called The Battle Over How to Redefine Death, and it was written by reporter Max Kozlov, who's with us to explain exactly what is going on behind the scenes that little of us are knowing about. So, Max, very interesting article. What's the big problem here? Help me understand why this has become an issue.
Yeah, so I don't think a lot of people realize that the entire concept of brain death is actually quite new, that it only originated in the late 60s. And basically, it got codified into a law in the early 80s saying, there are two types of death. There's the death that maybe you and I think about when we think about death, when your heart stops. And then there's this other kind of death that was only possible because of things like ventilators. Basically, when your entire brain shuts down, usually that means your heart also stops because there are parts of your brain that help you breathe and help you maintain a heartbeat. But with the ventilator, you're now all of a sudden it's able to breathe for you and make or get oxygen to all parts of your body, and it kind of looks like you're alive, even though all functions of your entire brain have stopped. And in all of these cases, really, clinicians say there's no chance of recovery. So this concept of brain death became important, well, one, for to communicate to families that, at this point, you have no chance, the patient has no chance of recovery, but then also, they have the opportunity to donate their organs if they so choose. At that point. So all these things were kind of happening all at once. But that law was codified in the early 80s, and it hasn't been changed since then. And since then, we've learned a lot more about what exactly brain death looks like. And in some cases, we've seen people who are still connected to artificial machine support for years even, so we can kind of see what being brain dead after a long time looks like. And in some cases, it doesn't fully line up with the law that was passed in the 80s. And that's why clinicians want to go back and revise it to make sure that what's happening in hospitals across the country is, one, uniform, but also squares with our understanding of brain death.
Your story begins by telling the tale of a young woman who faced just a horrible set of circumstances and her family, and how the ambiguity in the law led them down a path. Well, just walk us through that here again. Well, yeah, I think it paints the picture pretty well.
Yeah. This is kind of a stunning and honestly, very tragic case that happened. People might have heard of it. Because it unfolded over the span of nearly 5 years. It started in 2013 when a girl named Jahai McMath was undergoing a routine tonsillectomy. She was getting her tonsils removed. And, she woke up after the surgery, seemed to have gone fine until they discovered just a massive bleeding coming from the surgery wound. And it unfortunately led to her heart temporarily stopping, and that then meant that her brain wasn't getting the oxygen that it needed to perform. And the brain really rapidly loses functionality if it doesn't get the oxygen it needs, and so she suffered some very serious brain damage in that time. She was hooked up to a ventilator, and again, he, uh, uh, it looked as if she might be alive, because she it didn't look like she was dead. But after all these tests that clinicians do to make sure that that every possible cause, low blood pressure or hypothermia or all these different things, they went through this battery of tests and determined that she was indeed brain dead, that all functions of her entire brain had stopped. And this is difficult. I mean, if you're a parent in that situation, I mean, your daughter just went in for a routine tonsillectomy, and all of a sudden you're being told that she's dead. She's brain dead. And so this all unfolded in California, and she was issued a death certificate because, again, in these cases, there's no chance of recovery. And, there's this fear that if there's no chance of recovery, that the ICU could be filled with a lot of people who are in this kind of strange status.
Yeah, this suspended animation. And so the family then, for religious reasons, couldn't accept or didn't want to accept that, right? So, or that they would remove her from the machine. So they went to, was it New Jersey?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, there's a whole legal showdown that went down, where they tried to overrule the brain death declaration. The court said no, and there was this whole back and forth until I believe that they agreed to release her into her custody, and in that time, and brought her to New Jersey, which is the one state that allows for an opt-out for religious reasons to a determination of brain death. And there she stayed connected to artificial support for another 4.5 years. And in that time, she never demonstrably, there was kind of, they were trying to make the case that she was not brain dead, but the scientific consensus seems to be that although there were these limited movements that they saw, that those didn't amount to any kind of coordinated reflex, and that it didn't show that she was able to breathe on her own or was capable of consciousness on her own. And those are kind of the two fundamental tenets of what what it means to be alive, really, but also what brain death is kind of testing for, what all the tests look for. But then also, she, because she is a teenager at this point, she underwent her first menstruation, which kind of shocked everybody, because that's not something that you would maybe expect from somebody who is legally dead. And that actually kind of gets at the crux of some of these challenges to the notion of brain death, because if that were to be the case, if she had her first menstruation, then there's a part of the brain that usually kind of starts the cascade of hormones that are responsible, that are necessary to make that happen. But it's this very limited, very small part of the brain called the anterior hypothalamus. And what researchers told me is that that in some people who are brain dead, most people do not have any kind of activity there, but in a limited subset, because it receives blood in a different from the rest of the brain, that maybe function could be still preserved there. And that kind of goes against this whole notion of all functions of the entire brain. And, there could be a potential argument there to be made that not all functions of her entire brain had stopped, therefore she is not dead. But at the same time, it's not something that, of course, would necessarily help her recover in any way to be able to start breathing again or have the capacity for consciousness. It's kind of a bodily hormonal function, if that makes sense. So that was kind of the big challenge there, really, in kind of communicating to the public what exactly this notion of brain death is.
So just let's close that loop. Did she pass away? What finally happened with this young woman?
Yeah.
Okay.
After 4.5 years, she suffered another bout of internal bleeding. And at that point, her heart did stop permanently. And she was issued a second death certificate in the state of New Jersey. They had a legal challenge kind of based on this argument that I was just putting forward about the fact that not all functions of her entire brain had stopped. They're trying to get her death certificate in California erased. But with her second death certificate issued, they withdrew that complaint. But it's not just Jahia McMath. Brain death is rare. You know, the vast majority of deaths are declared under the cardiorespiratory criteria, we call them. But there have been other lawsuits that have been popping up in a similar vein. You know, there's just this, and it's not just limited to brain death. There's been much more pushback against the medical community and kind of questioning some of these things that we took maybe at face value when they first came about. And so that's part of the reason that this group of lawyers and clinicians and bioethicists have come together to try to iron this all out.
Yeah, it sounds so simple on a soap opera or a TV show, right? Oh, they declared him brain dead. But obviously, a lot of gray area here that these folks are trying to work out. Now, my understanding is this is a group of not necessarily doctors, but as you said, lawyers and others who are going to write some standards. And the expectation is then states would apply these standards to new laws, so we'd have a uniform kind of description of what brain death is. Is that where this is heading?
Yeah, so it's a little bit confusing because in the U.S., this Determination of Death Act is determined on a state-by-state level, not on a federal level, at least for now. And it doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. And so there's this organization called the Uniform Law Commission, and they write model legislation for all kinds of different things. And they make these model laws where, you know, it'd be really great if every state had the same law for this. And brain death is one of those things, or death in general. It's like you wouldn't want to be alive in one state and dead in another state. And so they urge state legislatures to adopt kind of their version of the law and try to kind of make sure they're as uniform as possible. And so basically the next steps here is there's this group of attorneys. On this committee, there's only attorneys who are able to vote on the actual legislation that they put forward, but they have kind of enlisted the help of clinicians and bioethicists who have chimed in discussions, but are ultimately, you know, not there to vote on the legislation that they are talking about. And then after it passes the Uniform Law Commission, at that point it's sent out to all of the state legislatures, and they can at that point decide whether they want to take it up, whether they want to revise it from the 1980 standard, if they want to revise it in their own way in any way, shape, or form. So it still faces quite the uphill battle, even if they decide on something that everybody's happy with, the state legislatures might not.
Yeah, and of course, politics would never get involved in any of that.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm on a transplant waiting list, what does this mean to me?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, a lot of this is still very hypothetical because we're still in the very drafting phases of this revised law. So it's hard for me to say with any kind of certainty, but some of the researchers I spoke with kind of painted a picture of why this debate is so important. And that's because even though brain death declarations are the minority of all death declarations, the majority of organs for transplantation come from brain dead patients. And this makes sense if you think about it. Organs have a very limited window in which they're viable. And so if you go to somebody whose heart has stopped, those organs aren't getting any more oxygen. Whereas somebody who is brain dead, because they're still hooked up to a ventilator, you know, you can kind of with with precision be able to take to procure organs for transplantation. And again, that's not the point of the concept of brain death, right? It's not just so we can take organs from people. It's also this notion of, again, clinicians worry that if everybody was able to opt out of brain death, then ICUs would be overrun, and they're already quite overrun with all of the usual suspects of things like COVID-19 and influenza and RSV. So to have another stressor on the system of kind of, as some of my sources said, hopeless cases, that's kind of part of the reason that this original concept came to be in the late 60s. And they stressed again and again that there has never been somebody who has regained consciousness or the ability to breathe after being declared brain dead. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But the standard that started here in the United States has now been adopted in the majority of countries around the world. So it's been a very powerful concept.
And your article points out the absolute importance of the detail here. So, for example, the word irreversible versus permanent. They kind of aren't the same, but yet they sort of have the same implication in this scenario. Explain that fine little detail.
Yeah. It's this had to be explained to me something like 10 times before I could wrap my head around it. But basically, the concept is that it's hard for clinicians to prove that something is irreversible, right? Because that would mean that maybe at time point, 10 minutes after the death is declared, would you then go in and try to restart heart or brain function? How about an hour after? Whereas if something is permanent, that kind of says that, okay, it stopped. We've tried to restart it maybe at the time, but it's if we let this be, this will be they won't regain heart or brain function. And the reason this is important isn't because clinicians, again, don't want to restart those functions. Of course they do.
Right.
It's because there are these new technologies, and this is part of the inspiration for the article to begin with. There's this kind of crazy experiment that was done where they, in pigs, were able to restart some cellular function in organs an hour after the pigs had died. And we're not talking about actually the kidneys starting to work or the brain starting to work in any way. And this is done in pigs. But I think clinicians are talking about it because, somewhere down the line, 50, 100, hundreds of years from now, if one day that is possible, they want to develop a framework that kind of accommodates for these intricate details where even if you could restart brain or heart function after 5 hours, I mean, would you want to? Is that sufficient to sustain a human life? And that's why they're talking about some of these nitty-gritty issues. There's also one other thing I'll say is there's this new type of organ donation called death after circulatory, or donation after circulatory death. And that is kind of when you're hooked up to a machine that, again, can keep your organs oxygenated after your heart has stopped. It kind of solves that problem of your organs starting to fail quickly after cardiac death. And so there's just new technology that is allowing more organs now than ever to be collected. But in those cases, again, it might still be possible to restart some heart function, but again, not in a way that perhaps sustains a human life. And so that's why they're talking about all of these really specific wording details.
Yeah, to that point, I walked away from your article thinking, as I'm writing an advance directive, you got to be very specific. You can no longer say in the event of brain death. Now you have to describe very specifically what brain death means to me, right?
Yeah. I mean, and one of my sources for this story, she's a pediatrician and bioethicist, and she said, honestly, more than anything, like this should be great incentive for you to to file an advance directive, to be thinking about these issues so that your loved ones aren't guessing what you would have wanted after or when you're in this kind of situation. That's where a lot of this is coming from, is this kind of disconnect between, the loved ones who are trying to make these really difficult decisions about what they would have wanted. But things like advance directives can help, underscore exactly what it is, how you want to be treated. If you're ever in that kind of situation. So she kind of reiterated, she made a plea of, talk to family members, talk to legal experts if you need, but have something on paper that kind of has something that says about how you want to be treated if you're ever in these kinds of situations.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Max, I appreciate your work on this article. I'll keep following this process. Maybe we'll talk again down the road. Thanks very much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.